I'm very thankful for the opportunity to join virtually, but I really wish I could be there with you in person. So in just a moment, I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get this rolling. But I do want to say we're going to go for about 15 minutes to an hour in the training portion, and there will be some. It's the interactive parts will be a little bit different because some of you are there, some of you are on screen, I'm on screen, but we're going to do our best with it, and then we'll have a discussion. So please save your questions as we go. If you're online, feel free to drop it in the chat, or just save those questions because we will have some discussion, and Chase will be helping to lead that after. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's go ahead and kick this off. So I'm trusting that y'all can see things. Yes, everything cool? Okay, awesome. We have been doing this training for a really long time because we work with a lot of faith communities and a lot of other groups that just feel like it's really overwhelming to when folks come and ask for help navigating the resources. I've been doing the work in Nashville for 15 years almost, and I still stumble on some of the resources. I still have a hard time and have to talk to coworkers because things are so tangled and not a super clear system. So just to start off, I can see the whole room now. Hi, all of you folks. Hi, beautifully socially distanced. Yes, wearing masks. It's so nice to see y'all. I want to start off just by saying thank you. Thank you for having us here. Thank you for your hospitality tonight, but also thank you for the ways that you supported our work in the past. I know that you are a group that cares deeply about not only missional living and mission work, but also social justice and the hospitality and mercy work. So thank you for the ways you supported us. I also want to say I'm sorry for the ways that our communication hasn't been as clear as it could have been the last few years. And I'm really hopeful, especially with Eric being there and the connection that we have, that hopefully we'll be able to do a better job in supporting y'all and partnering better. So I just want to say that out front. We are so dedicated to the work that we do and absolutely love our folks. And that's why we're doing trainings like this. So thank you for the ways you've joined us in that. So when we think about navigating the resources, often it's really easy to get tripped up and to really get focused in on the transactional piece of it, thinking about what resource do we give them? Do we give money? Do we give this or that? But just as Eric kind of mentioned at the beginning, where the transformation happens is through the relationships. It's through the interaction that respects the dignity of folks, that is mutually dignifying and respectful and transformative. And so I just don't want us to lose that piece before we get into the weeds of the resources, to just really highlight how important it is that people aren't problems to be fixed or cases to be managed. They're siblings. They are siblings to be loved and journeyed with. They are friends to accompany. So I always start off with that piece, just to remember, even if you can't fix something in the moment, just treating folks with dignity and respect and getting their name, that matters in the scheme of things, right? That matters. I can't tell you how many of our friends tell us how invisible they feel and how dehumanizing it is to live without what they need to survive. So just remembering that. So we're going to talk about a scenario that maybe it's happened to you, maybe it's not, maybe it will on Sunday. But let's just go with me to this scenario for a minute. It's a Sunday morning and you're greeting folks at the door, and you see a man stumbling over who appears to be experiencing homelessness. You haven't met him before, and he asks if you can help him with money for a hotel. It's going to be cold tonight and his sleeping bag got wet. So I want you to think for a minute. How many of you have actually been in that scenario, right? I imagine many of us. I want you to think about what you've said, what you would ask, and what you would do in that moment. And just kind of hold that for a second. And we're actually going to be doing some workshopping with the scenario at the end of the training. So as we're going through the training, I want us to keep coming back to scenarios like this to make it feel really tangible. And hopefully by the time you leave this training, you will have some more tools, have some more strategies, and feel a little bit more equipped. I know some of y'all are already amazing at it, and some of y'all do this all the time, and it's no big deal. So I also want to acknowledge the knowledge that we have in the room and the experience too. But let's keep that in mind as we go. Now, what's interesting is that, as Eric mentioned too, faith communities, I do this training with businesses and other organizations. I've done it with big corporations downtown. And what's interesting about you, Calvary, what's interesting about other faith communities is that we have a unique response to people, as Eric has already mentioned. It's not just like, oh, there's another person, like, okay, who can talk to him? We've got to figure this out. Let's get him on his way so we can get back to Sunday school. Our faith and our Holy Scriptures really do have a unique way of understanding the stranger as Christ, understanding folks who come in need, that they're not just a burden to us, but they're also a gift. So I just want to kind of root us in our faith for a minute and remember that all people are created in the image of God. Because if we can learn to shift the way we see folks, then it's going to radically transform our interaction with them, hopefully away from just that transactional nature. Now, there are some times when we cannot be present to the person, and they are going to be asking a lot of us that we don't have the space for. So is there someone else around who can be present? I've talked to some groups who kind of appoint a hospitality person or a hospitality team. So there's a pair of people for Sunday mornings, and those are kind of the people on call if something comes up. You may have a system like that, but that's been helpful to some groups. And that way, it really is, we're planning, like, just like the Good Samaritan was prepared and had what he needed in his bag to bind the wounds, we're trying to prepare ourselves for this happening. It's also really important that we remember that you are not responsible for everyone who comes to your door. You are responsible to them, to respond to the best of your ability, to respond and acknowledge your own limitations, what you have, what you don't have. A lot of us are fixers by nature. I am a fixer. And so when I started doing this work, it was really hard for me because I jumped in and I wanted to fix everything and take responsibility for everything and make everything okay for everybody else. I don't know if any of you are like that, but for those of us who are, we really have to remember that we're limited to, you're not an outreach worker. I'm actually not an outreach worker right now. I'm a part-time director of education and have a 16-month-old. So you have other responsibilities. We are responsible for our dependents, but everyone else, we bear collective responsibility to as a community, right? The responsibility to individuals doesn't rest individually on you. It rests on us as a collective. And that means we are in this with you, and we want to make sure you have the best resources you need. And also, if there's ever something that you can't figure out, we want to be there for you. So this is a collective responsibility we have. And again, it's not a responsibility to fix or save or tidy everything up. This is a call to accompany folks to the best of our ability. So that's kind of the grounding and rooting for this navigating the resources. Now, some of you may be a little bit newer to this, so I wanted to offer just a few tips for interacting. It's so important to get that human connection, to really try to connect and just get names and show that genuine empathy and care. Most of the people who come to us asking for help are in survival mode right now. That means that their brains are in this kind of like emotional survival mode, and they can read you really quickly and read other people. So if we're not genuine, people get that right off the bat. It's also hard for folks when they're in survival mode, literally because of like neurobiology, to think long term. So people are literally thinking about their immediate needs, and their instincts and emotions are going to be heightened. And that kind of long-term thinking is going to be lowered. So that's just really important to remember too. I always tell groups, whenever someone's coming to you with a story, always give them the benefit of the doubt, but also take everything with a grain of salt. So holding that balance, that kind of that with open hands, holding with where they're telling you, not feeling like you have to get to the bottom of everything is going to be important for your own sake. We also have to be honest about our limitations. And I hope that's something that you can all do individually, but also collectively as a church. One thing that I have a hard time with, and you might too, is that sometimes when somebody comes to us with a problem, we feel like we have to solve it right then or put the fire out then. And if you're the one responding, if you're in the office or you're at the door or you're just out in the community, it's important to remember that, it's okay to tell somebody, actually, I'm not sure right now. So I hear what you're saying. Let me get you a snack. Let me get you some water and let me talk to somebody else and put my head together with them. So if you can just kind of hang tight for a minute, always give yourself some time. Say, you know what, maybe could you come back? If it's a big thing and there's no one open, could you come back on a day that we're open? Could you follow up with in this way? It's okay to be honest about that limitation and just do the best you can with what you have, right? None of us are going to be able to do everything all the time. And it makes us human too, to have those limitations. We're going to do the best we can. I know just from talking with Eric about this training, I know you're already really prepared and you already have things like clothing closets that people can dip into when that's needed. But if there's other ways that y'all can be prepared to just have things on hand that people might need to make it easier, we always tell folks to carry survival kits in their cars, especially in the winter. Again, just carrying like individually carrying some hand warmers and thermal socks and some where to turn guides, which I think Chase brought to you tonight, which we'll be talking more about. Just carrying some of those things makes a big difference. So being prepared and thinking, what can you have on hand? And also you'll get all these slides. Eric has them, so we'll make sure everybody that needs them will get them. The next thing, jumping into now the navigating the resources part, is it's really important to know your role so you don't get overextended and overcommitted and overwhelmed. You got to think about where you fit on a given day. I want y'all to think about where you fit. It might be in between places on the spectrum of responses. Hopefully, most of us are not saying there's nothing I can do for you. We also don't want y'all to try to take on the person's whole life, because it's going to get really overwhelming really fast. So most of y'all are probably in the middle, right? And it's just really important to remember that on some days, if you're overwhelmed, you might not have the same capacity as you do other days. So remembering your role and thinking about how you can really be the connecting point for folks and other services like us, like other groups like Mental Health Co-op and Park Center. Now let's actually start to get into what happens when people come to you. Now, somebody's going to come to you asking for help, and you've really got to do the best you can with what you have. It's always important to not make promises, because when we make promises and can't follow through, even if we think we can, it breaks trust. It also means we don't make promises for others. I will never tell somebody, Chase can get you housing or Chase can get you this. I'll always say, we're going to do the best we can. It's also really important not to make promises for service providers like us or other groups that are also overwhelmed. This is a really hard time right now, which we'll be talking about a little bit more. The housing situation is incredibly difficult, and it takes a really long time to get folks in sometimes. So we're all in this together, and that's why OpenTable does the advocacy that we do for more housing and for better systems. But many of y'all know that when somebody comes to you asking for help, broadly asking for help, really trying to figure out where they can fit in and get services, it's really important to ask a couple questions first. And I'm not going to quiz you because I'm not in the room with you, and I can't hear your voices as well right now on the screen. So what are some of the first questions we should ask folks? I always say the first question to ask is, are they already working with somebody? We forget to ask that, right? And that means too often that if somebody is already plugged in with us, if somebody's already a case, like getting case managed through Park Center and almost has their housing, and you don't know that, you're going to be trying to recreate the wheel. So always ask if they're already connected, if they're already working with somebody. And then, a lot of the resources in Nashville are based on categories that people can fall under. And some of those categories are really personal parts, personal things about folks. But those categories are how that Where to Turn in Nashville guide that we're going to go through, that you have probably already seen, but we're going to go through in depth. That guide is organized. So we kind of need to know some personal questions. So I'll always say, is it okay if I ask you a couple personal things so I can figure out where you might fit if you're not already connected? And I'll go through this field. Think about those broad categories. Is somebody a veteran? Because if they are a vet, we could probably get them resourced the fastest of anybody in Nashville, other than folks that are positive for HIV/AIDS. There are the most resources there. Even some folks that have dishonorable or other than honorable discharges, we really want to encourage folks. There's a lot of resources. We need to know if they're a family member, like a family, have children. Of course, there's resources for folks fleeing abuse and violence and trafficking, and those are really sensitive questions. But if they are, we really need to know that so we can go there first. There are specific resources, right, for folks with mental health issues and substance use disorders. There's also some age categories. Um, I'm going to give you a list of some of the top numbers I would say program in your phone if you're going to be responding to folks. And the youth crisis line is one of those. If you talk to someone under 18, it's incredibly important that you do not leave them until they are connected with Oasis and literally get them there to the youth shelter. They can take it from there. But that is an especially vulnerable group. 18 to 24 also is really important to connect to Oasis, not the same urgency, but certainly incredibly important. And 62 and over, special housing that actually might have waiting lists open. So it's really important to know those age categories. Those are going to help you figure out where people fit in that broader group. Once we kind of have a feel for if there are specific groups geared toward the person and how they kind of fit in, of course, we're going to go through that resource guide and say, okay, if it's mental health, let's try here. If it's this, let's try here. But then it's really important to just focus in. Sometimes we assume what people need. Sometimes people tell us exactly what they need. Like they do not need us to guess or assume anything. They're like, I need X, Y, Z. I know my needs. Can you help? Okay. Other folks, if we can kind of figure out that one most immediate need or those one or two immediate needs and really focus in there, say, you know what, we're not going to be able to dive into everything today. So can you help me understand the one or two most pressing things for you? And let's see what we can do on that. Let's see if there's any connections we can make, or let's see if there's anything we have at our building. That can be a way to kind of focus in and kind of hone. And if those top priorities aren't things you can help them with, see if there's other things that you might be able to do just in a 5 or 10 minute conversation. Just focus in. We also use and teach on a strength-based lens. So when we're doing this work, it's really important to remember they've made it this far without you. They have used their resources or connections to navigate this. And that doesn't always mean people are going to make it after, but often they are. Often they're resourceful, they're going to try something else. So be curious. What did you do last time your sleeping bag got wet? Where did you go last time you didn't have a place to stay? What other shelter options have you tried in Nashville other than hotels? Really kind of opening up the conversation with them. What's interesting is when you ask those questions about what they've done before, it actually unlocks the part of your brain that goes offline during survival mode. The part of your brain, that critical thinking part of your brain, when you start asking them questions and engaging, that fires up again, right? it literally can go offline in crisis moments. So you're helping them think through what could work. That means the pressure's not all on you, and they do have strengths to contribute to this discussion. So just remembering that. I think people forget that a lot, which is why we add that in here. And then we always ask what someone's next step is. We're not going to prescribe them a plan. We can certainly send them on with bus passes or numbers to try or other things. But the plan always needs to be driven by them, and we are not responsible for the next step they take. We always want to say, what's your next step and how can we support? But it's on you, like we're going to try to make sure you have all you need to support you in this plan, but we can't do it for you, right? And I think that especially when we start journeying with people long term, it's really important to draw those boundaries and say, I can walk alongside you and accompany you, but I can't carry you through this whole thing because I won't make it either. Like I'm here to walk beside you. So just remembering that. Now, do y'all have the guides in the actual, was Chase able to bring those guides to you tonight? If you can just hold thumbs up because it's hard to hear in that space.
I totally forgot those at our office, but I'm bringing them for them tomorrow.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Well, the good news is that you'll have those tomorrow, and tonight that actually gives us a little bit more time to workshop some of the things that are actually important to y'all that you're dealing with. So no worries on that. Thank you, Chase. These Where to Turn guides, this is fresh off the press. It just came out earlier this fall, and we're really happy with the new revamped version. How many of y'all have used these guides in the past? Have any of y'all? Think you have? Yeah. So some of y'all are familiar with them. The table of contents and the index is your best friend, right? It's going to be super explanatory, and almost all of these resources that are in the guide are also online. So if you see this little wttin.org, you can save that web address on your computer, on your phone. And even if you don't have the guide, you can pull it up and say, hey, let me look up a few things while we're standing here talking. And that is really helpful too. So we're going to get the guides. You will get a whole box. You will have more than you need. And if you ever run out, all you need to do is email us and we will bring you some more. We want those guides out in the community. Give them to everyone. Carry them in your car. Seriously, let us know how we can help you stock up. These are in addition to having the guide, these are the numbers that I carry in my phone. So if you want, you will get this email to you, but you can also take a photo of these numbers if you want, or if you're on a screen, you can screenshot these numbers. These are what I would recommend programming into your phone if you do this a lot. And I heard one person from a church who put outreach and then, all these numbers after outreach in their phone, just so they could find them easily. But the two that I want to highlight for y'all, obviously there's a lot that you could find in the guide, but the two that I want to highlight for y'all tonight is the mobile crisis number. Has anybody that I can see in that room used mobile crisis in the past in Nashville? That is for people who are undergoing a mental health crisis and are either suicidal or having homicidal ideation, and they're safe, but they're just in a mental health crisis. Mobile crisis will actually send someone out to you to do an assessment with the person. It may take a while, which is the whole thing. They may send a police officer, which is often not very helpful. So it's helpful if you can stay and advocate. But that is a really important resource to know if someone is in a crisis. The other one I want to highlight is Tennessee Redline. You could go through the resource guide and learn every single service provider that helps with substance use disorders. But even when you do that, there's a lot of places that don't have beds open for folks without insurance. And it's incredibly difficult to figure out where people can go when. Tennessee Redline is a statewide resource that will even help people get into rehab in Kentucky if they need it. Like if you have to go across state borders, they're a phenomenal resource. They're 24/7 call line. So that is where I would start with all things related to substance use disorders. Call them in addition to the resources that you have in the Where to Turn guide. Any questions about so far the numbers, any numbers listed on here? And I think I can hear people with mics. So Chase, I can probably hear you and Eric, but not anybody else. So any questions so far?
If anyone on in person has a question, they can come up to this little mic right here. And then I guess Andy will watch for closer. Okay. Wide up on that one and far back from this one. And if I guess you'll watch for folks online on Zoom with questions. Okay, perfect. Just one quick question, Lindsay, talking about the Tennessee Redline. Also, I wonder if here in Nashville, it's similar that people might also go to the emergency room for detox, and at least for some substances. And from there, their social workers often are helpful for doing that work of finding them a bed in long term. Is that something that's true here as well, or is really Redline the primary way to go?
So the hospitals, if so there are certain substances that you would detox from, including alcohol, right? You would need some medical detox to do that. And Vanderbilt and Centennial and Skyline sometimes take folks for medical detox. The problem is often that they sometimes don't have beds. And even when they do have beds, we have a very difficult time getting people into programs after they go through that, 2 to 7 day detox situation. So most folks are still going to need this. There are programs like Nextdoor and Buffalo Valley and some others that actually have detox as part of the treatment programs. And if you can get a bed somewhere that does detox and the bed for that longer 28-day or 48-day or whatever they program, then that's going to be better for you. So even if you do recommend, people can always go to Vanderbilt ER, but it's hit or miss with things because it's so wild right now. I would still recommend giving that Tennessee Redline number to them in case the social worker can't find one, which is what often happens. So that is a really good point though, Eric. Thank you for bringing that up. I'll also say that, Chase will talk about how our resource line works in a little while, but if you're running into somebody that is falling through all the gaps and really just isn't getting what they need and just not having success, talk to Chase, give that number. That's what the resource line is there for. It's for the people that are falling through the gaps of our existing system. So he can talk more about that too. If y'all have any other questions, feel free to hop on, but we'll also have some more discussion after this because we're going to get in deep to some housing stuff in a few minutes. Now, there are some pandemic resources in addition to the guide. And if you're getting in deep on the resource work, then I would recommend saving these on your browser, these websites on your browser, because there are specific COVID-related funds in the last year and a half that have gone through to help with rental assistance that aren't necessarily the, Metro Action Commission or the regular folks we would go to. So there may be some additional resources on here. I'll also say if you talk to anybody that needs health services, including vaccines, testing, and other COVID resources, neighborhood health, I want to give a big shout out to them. They're incredible. They've done so much and they can get somebody vaccinated like that. So whatever vaccine they want, all the things. So shout out to neighborhood health. Now, without boring you too much, I'm going to talk briefly about the broader housing system in Nashville, because these are the nuts and bolts that a lot of us kind of need to know, the bigger level, like zoomed out bird's eye view. of what's going on in Nashville. And then we'll get into some nitty gritty, like here's your cheat sheet on what to do with specific folks. So the broader range, there are obviously a lot of places people find shelter. People are unhoused both outside the system, they're visible, invisible. These are the folks we see sleeping rough on the streets, doubling up in their cars at the Walmart parking lot, all of that. We also have the formal crisis response facilities. Those are emergency shelters, our inpatient facilities, and our jails where people are staying. And then we have transitional housing with support and all of those programs that we're really grateful to have. Don't forget about transitional housing when people are asking for housing. We don't have as much of it in Nashville as we used to because the funding shifted away from transitional toward permanent several years back. But we do have some, and those are really important to remember, including Salvation Army that often has beds for single adults. So Salvation Army is a really good place to start in terms of transitional housing that will then connect folks with employment, then connect folks with housing and things like that. Then in addition to the folks that are sheltered or unsheltered, we have a lot of different housing options, and this is this most simple way we could break it down. There's permanent supportive housing, and those are the places we really love because it's not just a bed and a place, but it's also case management and support around folks. Then we've got our affordable or low income housing. Those are our deeply subsidized units, both, the projects, Section 8, public housing. We've got nonprofit housing like Urban Housing Solutions. And then you've got just the kind of what people used to call naturally occurring affordable housing, which actually isn't naturally occurring because now it's gone in Nashville. But things like trailer parks and things like that, we used to have more success getting folks into, but that's been harder. Then what's new because of COVID is we have a lot more rapid rehousing programs that are, and Chase could talk more about this if you have questions, that are really like allowing folks that get certain grants, government grants, often through pandemic related funds. Folks are moving into hotels with a year-long lease, and sometimes those leases are getting extended and sometimes they're finding permanent housing, but that is not guaranteed. So when you hear the mayor of Nashville saying, Nashville's housed 500 people in the last, year or whatever, that's not entirely accurate. A lot of those folks are in rapid rehousing and hotels, and they're not guaranteed to be permanent. So that's just something to remember. So those are the housing options that we're kind of working with here. If you see anything I missed, please let us know because it's a very complex system, but that's what we're looking at. In order to try to coordinate all these different options for folks, Nashville now has a coordinated entry system. And Eric, I'm sure you're familiar with these from Georgia, but this is kind of a shared citywide system where there's a database that everyone can access that has been trained in that system. Metro Homeless Impact Division is currently over this system in Nashville. And there's a website, you can go onto it, you can nerd out at all the forms and also feel overwhelmed at all the things. But being part of this coordinated entry system can help prioritize some of the most vulnerable people for housing. And it can help, we can even sometimes get folks deposits paid or things like that. So it's a really, there are parts of the coordinated entry system that are working well. For instance, like families, there's a family coordinated entry system within the broader coordinated entry system. And when families come on the scene and they can't, they're looking for housing, they go straight to the coordinated entry system. And then that's what prioritizes people for beds at Family Safe Haven, right? So they have to go, they can't just go to Safe Haven anymore. They have to go through the family coordinated entry system. And if you go back to that, that number list up here, there's a coordinated entry. I believe I have that on here, but certainly you can find it in too. Hey, Chase, can you see if that coordinated entry system, I think since I've done this last, this number changed. Can you pull up the CES intake line just so we can give it to them at the end,
Yeah, can I add something to that as well, Lindsay?
please?
If you're working with a family, coordinated entry will let you do an intake over the phone, which is much easier. But if you're working with individuals that you want to get into the coordinated entry system, they have to be physically present at a place that does intakes, like the Salvation Army, or at a metro center. So that's important to keep in mind, because sometimes those can feel really inaccessible.
Totally. And the coordinated entry system, what's important to understand, the city wants to get everybody into the coordinated entry system because they want better data. But being in that system does not guarantee you housing. So a lot of people, they get input into the system and then they think, oh, I've got housing, I'm waiting for housing now, which isn't the case. So there's some extra steps to talk to folks about that, but it can help prioritize people for housing. So we are trained in this system. Their Metro Homeless Impact Division does the trainings for it, but just so y'all know, that's how that works. I'm not going to go over all these definitions with you unless you want to. We do have a COC, which is a continuum of care here. That's kind of the governance council for homelessness in Nashville, and it kind of takes a lot of the federal funds that come down and helps prioritize them and distribute. They have monthly meetings. They're very bureaucratic, and often most of our advocacy happens outside of them, but that is part of the system in Nashville that we're a part of. So I'm also not going to go step by step. I just want to show you there is a process that this is how they say people get housing through CES, and sometimes it works. You meet somebody, you do an intake, you get all their documents, you submit all the applications, then you wait. That waiting box should be about 50 times that size because the waiting can be extremely long. Then you get, maybe if there is for Section 8, you get approved for a voucher, you get the briefing, then eventually you get the voucher, then you got to find a landlord, then you got to get the inspection and all the move-in costs and your furniture and all of that. Or maybe you find other subsidized housing. It is a very complex process, which is why we have housing navigators on our staff that do this full-time with folks. But that's kind of, it's okay to tell people, hey, I'm not a housing navigator, but let me try to point you to a group that does do that, right? So to remember that. This process is incredibly mangled, and it is very frustrating. And sometimes it changes on us, and we have to figure it out and tell people that it's now changed and we have to get more documents from them. So just so you know, it's a very difficult thing to get folks housing right now in Nashville, especially for Section 8 vouchers or other subsidized housing, because the need is so great. Do y'all remember, how many of y'all heard about at this past spring, the mayor doing an affordable housing task force? Do y'all remember that? Well, one of the findings that the task force came out with was that by 2030, Nashville's facing a deficit of over 50,000 units of affordable housing, most of those at the lowest income brackets. So this is why we want you to join us in the streets when we go to City Hall or go to the courthouse for the advocacy efforts. We can't put people in units that we don't have. And right now, the only move-ins we're getting are through waiting lists where people were either evicted or died. That's how we're getting people in. There are very few new units coming. And even when new units come online, we're losing some because of gentrification. So it is a very bleak housing picture. And I just want to be real about that. Now, this is where you actually get a few extra tools to feel like, okay, even when it comes to housing and the system is complex, I still have a few things I can do and a few things that I know, like where to send people. And Chase, were you able to get this handout for folks?
Which handout?
This one,
Yes.
the housing resources.
Yes.
Awesome. If you'll pass that out, we'll go over this. Thank you forever so much for getting that.
Oh, of course. The least I can do is half of my job.
I really appreciate you. So this document is a cheat sheet that we put together, and I imagine you're looking at the screen and it's all tiny. That's why Chase is passing this out to you. And I'll make sure to send this to Eric too. So if y'all want to print off more copies, you have it. Now this is what I made for myself and our new outreach workers. It's our cheat sheet. When it's like the quick and dirty, like housing in Nashville. It's echoed in the Where to Turn guide. So there's similar, the same information is in the Where to Turn guide, but I found it was really helpful to have a one pager that I could really just be like, okay, this is really going to be some of my main resources that I use. So if you'll spend just a minute with this, you'll start to see, I want you to look at the categories first, right? Really thinking about those categories. There's the coordinated entry number. So do y'all see that under families? There's that, that is the coordinated entry system number, I believe. Is that right, Chase? Am I saying this is a coordinated entry number, right? Because it changed.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. That is the number to call. But this is where you would tell people to start. So if they're just coming to your door and they're asking about housing and you've got the Where to Turn guide and you've got this, you can at least point them in a really good direction forward. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory. Now, people who are over 62 or have disabilities, there are some waiting lists that sometimes open for them. And that's why we recommend going on those sites, because there are certain towers that open. If they're over 62, there's often a waiting list open that they can get in, or there will be soon. So those waiting lists, those are public housing waiting lists. Now, the folks who are long-term, like chronically unhoused, which is either a year or I think it's like 3 to 4 episodes and 3 to 4 years is the chronically homeless definition, which you do not need to worry about. Those are the folks that might get a priority, like in the coordinated entry system for a Section 8 voucher or something like that, if they were to get into an agency and then get housing services through that agency. There are a lot of people that can't get subsidized housing because of background stuff, and that is really hard. There's just a few resources that overlook some things. Those are not great resources, but they are there. I want to highlight one more resource. A lot of times we'll have friends that call who have incomes and are working, and they just need something that is subsidized. I always recommend Urban Housing Solutions. So, I think I just highlighted the whole thing. Urban Housing Solutions is under this other low income option. And I always tell people, you know what, you might qualify for Urban Housing Solutions because they are a nonprofit that gets subsidies and subsidizes their housing. So try them first. And if that's not working, then call us back. And that has gotten a number of folks into that already have income. So in addition to this, also I recommend, of course, the Where to Turn guide, because there are some more things, but that's your one-page cheat sheet. And this is your cheat sheet when it comes to documents or expungements or things like that. So I want to ask Chase, as y'all are just kind of scanning over this, documents are really important, and we cannot get people into housing without their documents. So this is something that we can all try to point people in the right direction or do. And there are folks that are undocumented. Anyway, I wanted to ask Chase, is there anything else you would add to this sheet, the cheat sheet thing, or kind of first line of response kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lindsay. So this sheet is really helpful in outlining kind of the bare bones skeleton of immediate responses that you can take for people who fall into those certain categories. I would say that there are resources beyond this sheet that will be available for you when I bring you the Where to Turn in Nashville guides tomorrow. Primarily under the people with a mental health diagnosis, people with a mental health diagnosis section. The only resource that's actually listed there on this sheet is Park Center, which is probably the resource that I refer people to most often because they have the most resources and often have the most beds. But there also are two other organizations called Centerstone and Mental Health Co-op that do really similar kinds of work. And often those organizations work with people who both have mental health issues and also substance abuse disorders. And so those are really important numbers to keep around. But this sheet can be very helpful just for sort of immediate first line sorts of questions.
Are there any questions about, especially like clarifying questions about this sheet or just kind of this cheat sheet idea? Any questions that anybody has right now? Or comments or commentary or anything? We'll keep rolling, but please feel free to interrupt me. Now, if you're going to be doing this for a while, or even if I wasn't, I'm actually not a housing navigator right now because I'm doing our education program. I'm still on the waiting, or I'm still on the email list for MDHA. It's really helpful to be on this email list if you have any interface with folks that are housing insecure, because once a year, every property at MDHA that is owned by MDHA, Metro Development and Housing Agency, the waiting list will open. And they email out. The way they let people know when the waiting list is open is they email it out. Sometimes they'll email you and they'll say, next Wednesday at 12 o'clock, this waiting list opens and it closes at Friday at 2. Maybe somebody comes to your office that Wednesday at 12 and you're like, oh my gosh, there's a waiting list and you qualify. So would you like to just sit here and do this application? That's going to be their best chance at trying to get on that waiting list because it's going to close in 2 days or a week or however long it's open. But that you can email this email address and get on that email list so you're notified. And that's really important just to know. So, yeah.
The applications for those wait lists are incredibly simple. I mean, we're talking 10 minutes or less, 15 minutes or less to get people on those waiting lists. So if that's something that you're going to do and you have the ability to prioritize that, if you're working with somebody, it's really important because there are 506 people on the list who receive these emails. And when those wait lists open, there immediately are housing navigators from all over the city applying people to those wait lists that have been waiting for them to open. And it's a first come, first served situation. So whenever those wait lists open, I try to get all the people I'm working with who are eligible and just apply them immediately, right on the hour when that opens up.
Totally. So this is one of the ways we're getting people in right now. And we're really thankful for that. There are other creative ideas. Some are a struggle, like hotels and motels aren't sustainable. It's so hard. They might be a stopgap measure, or like it is just a really hard thing to sustain. And we do not have, unless there's a family in the winter or a very specific situation where they're falling through all the gaps and it's dire and there's a long-term plan in place, we often will not do hotels or motels just because we can't sustain it. That is hard. I am happy to talk more about that, but these are some other things that we have to be creative sometimes. Sometimes we have to get people tents because they're a couple and they have nowhere to go until the overflow shelter opens at 28 degrees. But there are always things that could help people's eligibility for housing, like the expungements, which you now have information on. So I want to, I'm gonna just, I actually want to take the temperature and see. We've covered about an hour of the main training resources. We just put together a brief winter outreach information packet that I could do in about 8 to 10 minutes for you if you want to know kind of the updates on where things are this winter, or we could turn it over to Chase for discussion. Do y'all want to do the winter part, or would you rather spend more time in discussion right now? I actually can't hear anything. So whatever.
I think they want to hear winter, Lindsay.
Okay. Very briefly on the winter stuff. We've boiled this down. The ways to stay updated this winter on where to go and all of that stuff, what's open, are these three things. You've got your website, coldweathernashville.com, always updated every day. You've got your call line. This is something you can literally call with the person and say, let's see if the overflow shelter is open tonight. Da, 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 da. And it'll have a recording. You can also text Nashville Winter, and you can sign up for text alerts for when the overflow shelter for the cities are open. I'm going to talk about what that overflow shelter is, but it's a really important resource for folks who often won't go to the other shelters like the Mission or things like that. So we've got our day shelters, which many of you already know about. These are places that people can get out of the cold during the day, of course. We've got Room in the Inn, Community Care Fellowship on the east side, the Nashville Rescue Mission. What's different about the Mission this year, there are a few things that are different. You know, it used to be that there was a men's mission downtown and then the women's mission on Rosa Parks, right? The women's mission on Rosa Parks is closed. It's actually bulldozed because they're renovating it. So all of the women and children are at the men's mission too. And that is actually good for some families that can stay closer together and don't have to split up so far. But it's caused some problems for other folks, especially for folks that are on the sex offender registry and are trying to rebuild their lives, but now they can't seek shelter there. So that's been really hard. We always encourage folks to go to the libraries and community centers during the day too. But folks on the registry can go to Room in the Inn and Community Care Fellowship for day shelter. Now, this is a convoluted mess. We can send this to you. You can take a picture of it, or just, if I can just go through this very quickly with you. There are basically three main shelters. And then if you include Oasis for the underage youth, there are four. But the three main shelters, we're gonna go over what's new with them this year. I've already talked about some of the men and women's mission kind of new things. One of the new things is that they are taking pets, especially dogs, when they have space available. So they are taking pets. People can sleep with their animals, which is really important, like in a kennel in the same room. But if they run out of space, they run out of pet space. So they ask people to get there early for the pets. Couples can't sleep together at night, but they can be in the same building. Male partners in a family can't sleep with a family, but they can be in the same building. If folks are transgender, the mission will try to do the best they can to work with folks on the gender that they identify with, and they're trying to do that. So Room in the Inn, has really had a very challenging couple years. Last year was really difficult because of the pandemic. They're back and they're doing more beds. You may have beds at your church with Room in the Inn this year. I'm not sure, but they have less beds, so they're only doing men, and it's harder and harder to get a ticket now. So people have to be there pretty early to get a ticket and to go through all the orientation stuff. So definitely encourage folks to go there. Now, the most important thing to know is that when it hits 28 degrees, which it might later this week, that's when Metro's Overflow Shelter opens. And thankfully, it's not at the detention center or the jail this year, which it was last year and year before, and it was really difficult. It's at a repurposed school off Brick Church Pike. Pets are welcome, couples welcome. The only group that's not welcome is minor children. They would need to be at the women's mission or figure out something else. If there's a dad with children, then we'll figure out something, maybe a hotel until we can get them in somewhere. But everybody is welcome. It's low barrier, master required. That's only open when it's 28, which I think is a travesty. So if you're on the sex offender registry, you have to wait until it's 28 degrees to get shelter, which is, it's terrible. But that is where we are. Launchpad is not doing emergency shelters. If y'all know Launchpad, they do LGBTQ plus friendly youth. They're not doing emergency shelters this year. They're focusing on transitional housing. So Oasis for underage youth is really where we would need to focus. Again, Metro's overflow shelter. It's a big space. They can, if somebody comes in with a temperature, they can put them in a completely different wing in order to keep everybody COVID safe. Masks are required. You find out through, the website or text notification or call system if they're open. So that's a number to have handy. There is transportation to the shelters in the evenings and back in the mornings through bus passes. If we're going to get super technical, the 23B line is going to go straight to that shelter this year. Literally going to drop people off at the door. And if people can get to the WeGo Central downtown, they will get free rides to that shelter when it's 28 or below, which is a really big improvement from last year. There are also a lot of pickup spots across town that people can go to and get picked up for the shelter. So this is your beautiful chart. We will send all this to you if you happen to need it, or I'd be happy to get you the information in a different way if it's helpful. This just got released like in the last 2 weeks. So those are the other pickup spots. We're going to be out when it's 28 or below. Our friends at People Loving Nashville are going to be doing the east side. So we do have people out those evenings, and during the day, all through the winter, during the day, we're getting people things, propane, sleeping bags, all of that. We stay very busy. And ways to help. Our biggest need right now is supplies. It's just supplies. It could be used blanket. It could be gently used blankets or sleeping bags or thermal socks. Anything like that is really huge for us. So those are some of the biggest ways to help right now. And that is the shortest, I think that's all. That's the shortest winter outreach thing I've ever done. It's, if it's this hard for us to explain and understand, think about how hard it is for folks on the streets, right? It's a really difficult situation. So I want to circle back to our scenario that we started with, and then I'll close my time. We've got the guy who came up to us. What do we want to make sure we do in our response to him that Sunday morning? What are some of the things we want to say to him? What are some of the things we want to ask? What options do we have for him? And what are we going to do in that moment? So if y'all just want to maybe talk at your table or just have a discussion for a couple minutes about it. I do not have to hear you. I can trust that Eric and Chase can hold things down. But I'm going to actually turn this over to Eric and Chase now. If we want to talk about the scenario for a minute, let's do that. And just remember, I can only hear you if you're at the mic. So I'll just trust you all to handle this. And I'll just kind of
share. And we can share the mic too. This would be easier to pass around. Yeah, if this is a good transition point, Lindsay, I mean, it sounds like Chase can take over. Thank you so much for your time tonight. We're so grateful for you and your work, and grateful to have a partner like OpenTable Nashville. So thank you.
Thanks for having us both.
I have a quick question for Lindsay.
Mm-hmm.
On that previous slide, you had a thing about emergency kits, have survival kits and hand them out. What were the survival kits? Is that the socks and the hand warmers and that type of thing?
Absolutely. Yep, you're on it.
Okay.
Thanks for asking that, Susan.
So let's talk just briefly about the scenario, about how we could respond, and about what our first points of action would be. Does anybody have thoughts that they'd like to share around that, or concerns, or just questions about the material? I really want this to be the most productive and helpful it can be for y'all. So don't hold back. Don't pull any punches. If you have any questions, please ask.
to think about, to sort of have a supply of questions to ask them. Never really thought about that, what did you do last night? What was your plan in case this didn't happen or whatever, just to get, more of the landscape of what they're dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that because I think that Lindsay talked about this just briefly, but when we encounter somebody who's experiencing homelessness, we oftentimes have this assumption that they're in the same situation as everybody else who's on the streets, when in reality, there's a lot of variety between what happens. So that's always my first step, is asking questions and trying to get a little better sense of the situation.
My question is, thinking of this as a church body, is how can we prepare those of us who aren't here getting this information? Is there something we can prepare for the narthex so that when somebody comes to the front of the church and whoever's there greets them, they have a resource that doesn't look to the person like, oh, they're just going to a book that they're not really listening. They're
Right.
just, so is that, I don't know how to word it other than that. Is it going to put the person off to see somebody go to a resource guide to ask them the questions that we need to ask?
No, yeah, I love that question. It can certainly, especially for people on the streets, encountering all these systems and protocols can get really jaded. They can get really jaded from that. So I really appreciate that question. I think that what I would say is that it's really important to recognize the humanity in the people that we're meeting on the streets. So I will do trainings like this with groups as young as middle school age. And what I always tell them is, if you encounter somebody, even if you or your family don't have resources to provide, the most important thing is to look into the eyes of the other person and let them know that you see them. And I think similarly, even when we're in a setting like this, where we're getting the navigating the resources training, and the goal is to be able to point them in the right direction, you always want to start off by asking their name and trying to make a personal connection with them, because they're going to see through the protocol, and if you can connect with them as a person, they're gonna feel much more welcome. But I would add to that this information is really hard to sort of get a grapple on. All of the knowing the resources in Nashville and where to direct certain groups of people is like 85% of my job. And it's full time. So like it's a lot. And things are constantly changing. But I do think that if you can keep those sort of 8 or so questions that we went over earlier in the slideshow, just to kind of keep those general categories in your head, it's really helpful, because if you encounter somebody and you ask, well, are you a veteran? Then you immediately know I can point them in the direction of Operation Stand Down or the VA. Or if they have mental health issues, you can point them to Mental Health Co-op or Center Stone or Park Center. And so I think after familiarizing yourself with the resources, you sort of get familiar with the general landscape of how to do that.
One of the things that I learned from what Lindsay said a few minutes ago is to ask a few more questions about, like, have you ever been in this situation before? Have you reached out to any other resources that were successful? What assets do you have to address to this situation? Is there something we can help connect you with that could make that one missing step that you have about making the contact? So again, affirming the fact that they have resources available to them, not just assuming that they have nothing and that we're the only source of what they need.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. spend a lot of time thinking about that at OpenTable. When we talk about being responsible to people, but not for them, about people not being problems to be solved or cases to be managed, because there's this tendency in the service world to reduce people to their situation. And that can really be dehumanizing for folks. And we want to have relationships that go beyond that sort of care provider situation, which is why when you hear us talking about people we work with, you'll never hear the word clients. You'll always hear friends. So we definitely try to bring that in full force with the people we're working with.
The other thing that I would maybe add, just in my experience, is that sometimes, like Lindsay said, I'm very much, a problem solver, and it's easy to sort of be functioning out of that part of my brain. Oftentimes when people come to you, I think also they're also looking for sort of this transactional thing, because like Lindsay said, they're in survival mode, so it's not, so I think, as we're affirming the worth of folks and sort of having this conversation with them, it may or may not be that they are immediately with you in that conversation, if that makes sense, because they are in survival mode, at least in my experience. So it does make it kind of tough, but to try to move it in that direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's we talk a lot at OpenTable about trauma-informed interactions, and it's important to remember that I especially with my growing up experience in a fairly affluent, completely white Church of Christ, I automatically, in the middle of the Midwest, I immediately assume that everybody I interact with is just going to have some baseline level of trust to each other and be comfortable sharing significant amounts of personal information. And that's just not true for everybody. And so recognizing that people are going to have varying levels of comfortability with interacting with you. Yeah, that's really, really important.
Okay. These are all great resources, and I appreciate that. But we encounter people on Sunday morning.
Mhm.
These resources are available Monday morning.
Mhm.
What do we do from Sunday till Monday morning?
I really appreciate this question because as an outreach worker and somebody who's working in the outreach world, it's really difficult to cut yourself off from 9 to 5, right? It's something that a lot of outreach workers aren't good at doing. It's something that a lot of outreach workers don't do. But the reality of the situation is that the most valuable resources that people are going to have access to, and the ones that are going to lead them to long-term solutions, probably aren't going to be available until Monday morning, depending on the case they're working with or the people they're working with. What I would say is it's important to do a couple of things. One is building standing relationships with folks that extend past that one Sunday morning interaction is critical. The more that people feel like they're welcome at your building, the more people feel like this is a safe place to come, then I think the more that problem will fade into the background a little bit. The other thing I will say is we get floods of emails and phone calls over the weekend, and we respond to them as quick as possible. So our info line is always open for messages, for emails, for phone calls. And if you can text our info line, and that will come directly to my email inbox, and I'll see it because I'm the person that responds to those emails. I guess what I'm trying to say is we want to fix these issues, and our response is to always want to solve the problem as quickly as possible. And it's always hard news to deliver that these problems aren't quickly solved. And that truly the only immediate shelter option in Nashville that you can go into the day that you're seeking it is the mission, is the reality of the situation. So unless there's somebody in the congregation who's willing to front money to put people in hotels, because like Lindsay was talking about, that can get excruciatingly expensive, and there really aren't hardly any nonprofits in the Nashville area who do that, other than in very extreme circumstances. the mission is really the only option, and a lot of folks don't want to go there for a wide variety of reasons.
And Chase, I think I echo everything you said. The only other thing I'd add is, there are some emergency resources that are still available. You've got the 24-hour call lines, whether that's domestic violence or the substance use disorder thing. There's statewide crisis text lines that you can use. And then, obviously the ERs, obviously the overflow shelter, if it's going to be under 28 degrees, that's also additionally open. But it is really difficult because there just aren't those places open during those times. So it's an extra difficult thing that you're asking, and I would totally hear you. So yeah, and thanks, Chase, for what you shared. I just wanted to add those emergency things.
So is that where, just on a practical level, we should, as a church, have tents available and the, emergency kits with Mylar blankets? I mean, just literally physical things, physical forms of shelter to hand out, or would you recommend fronting the money for a motel for certain people? I mean, is that what we as a church in an affluent area can do? I mean, yeah, when is that a good idea and when is that not a good idea on a Sunday?
Yeah, I love this question. That's fantastic. My initial reaction is that we should be willing to give to our neighbors whatever we're capable of giving them in good faith to the best of our ability, which means that buying a motel room for somebody for one night, if we're not willing to go the journey with them and journey alongside them, isn't much of a solution. But there are definitely situations in which that is worth doing. And like, depending on the resources that are available, I think there are many situations in which that is worth doing. What I'm saying is that I think that you have to make a commitment to know that that is entering a bit of a longer term relationship than sending somebody away with a tent. So, being realistic about what we're capable of accomplishing is really important. But I do think that having physical resources around is a great idea. That's something that we always recommend.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question in terms of it's a good question in terms of our our responsibility, as Christians and living in an affluent area in an affluent congregation, as you said. And so I think there is a lot of guilt there and a sense of, I can do something. This is this small, so shouldn't we be doing more? And I will tell you that I don't think that this gets any of us off the hook. And I think we need to struggle with these questions personally. I think it's important to struggle with these, and we don't just easily, say, well, it's taken care of, or throw our hands up and say that it's not. It's forcing us to sort of use our higher brains, right? And to sort of ask these questions. I think that's a part of discipleship also. But I will say that even though it does not get us off the hook, that I can tell you that Calvary has made serious commitments, financial commitments to organizations, to OpenTable Nashville and to Community Care Fellowship. So that doesn't cover all of our sins and our responsibility to people, but know that your resources and your donations to the church is supporting good work that is helping to not just tide people over for a day, but to really help them to transition out of homelessness, out of those situations and into a more permanent solution. So it is just worth noting that that this is something that Calvary cares a lot about, and it has put its money where its mouth is. I hope that we can do more, but I'm very proud of this community for the work that it's done.